So there are certain books that have ended up sort of backfiring on me in that reading them has taken me further away from accepting or at least being open to the conclusion of the authors than I was before reading them. And in every case, it's not because the books were necessarily weak, but it's because either the books were actually quite strong, or because even if the book was weak, the author was someone I would have expected to be credibly able to make possibly the best case for this argument. And the fact that they couldn't address what I saw as fundamental underlying concerns, or even raise new concerns that I hadn't really thought of, ended up, in the long run, taking me away from that position. And so I have 9 of these books, of which all of them I've read since my father died. Most of them I've read in the past year, but I'm actually going to start with one that I read a little longer ago, which if you've seen my most watched video on gender, which you probably have, then you know I talked about Bell Hooks' The Will to Change, and particularly Chapter 7, and how on one hand, like, she acknowledged my experiences that I'd had in feminist circles and made me feel seen because I hadn't really been able to recognize or acknowledge these things myself. But on the other hand, I realized she was raising this 30 years ago, and it was still going on, and that was when I was like, I don't know if I can still identify as a feminist, and it took a while longer before I stopped. And one of the factors in that was that, not the only factor, but I've always, and I indicated this in my video, objected to the idea of being called a male feminist, even when I identified as male and feminist simultaneously, which is for 2 reasons. One of which is that my commitment to feminism was ideological, based on my understanding of liberal feminism, and that it served everyone's interests, particularly mine as someone who is weird about a lot of gender things. And the second is that male feminist and its previous incarnation, male feminist ally, both indicate a particular kind of aggressive, performative, sort of male person who, like, one of my frustrating experiences is that a lot of feminist women would be like, you need to go out and argue with men more and be more aggressive. And I'm like, no, that is not who I am, how I act. And there's a tendency to reward this sort of aggressive, performative virtue signaling from men who identify as feminist, and that's what I associate with male feminists. I've always found it both irritating and also kind of suspect, and so when I hear various scandals around male feminists, I'm like, it doesn't really surprise me, because you're sort of inviting the fox into the henhouse thinking it's going to protect you. Anyway, so YouTube was recommending a little bit after I read this book some male feminist YouTuber who I hadn't found his stuff convincing, but I kept watching his shorts. And in one of them, he was like, how can you say feminists don't care about men when Bell Hooks and Brene Brown both care about men? And I was like, wait, my contention was that feminist theory often addresses male issues, but women who identify as feminist in practice tend to sort of act as Bell Hooks described. Could you really not find any other examples besides Hooks and Brown? And so my reading of The Will to Change is basically that Bell Hooks, and she's arguing for a feminist audience, but she's arguing that masculinity and feminism are compatible. And when I finished this book, I was like, yeah, I still think it is, even if I was no longer sure if I was going to identify as a feminist. But with time, I've sort of become... I appreciate her analysis, and she doesn't provide a prescriptive solution, but I'm just increasingly not convinced that they are. And so in that case, that was a book where I already started off agreeing with a lot of what she was going to say, and it took me further away. The next one was the opposite, and I've talked about this one in my video on marriage, and I was not expecting that this would convince me to be opposed to marriage equality. As I said, it would take a lot to do it, but what I was thinking it might do was potentially convince me that there is a compelling, secular, non-religious case to be opposed to same-sex marriage. And while they convinced me sort of the value of complementarity where I was going anyways, the way that they handled talking about what traditional marriage looked like, it showed both extreme anthropological and historical ignorance about other cultures and religions, and their arguments were also very clearly not just Christian but Catholic coded in a way that I was like, if this is the best you can do, like, and I'm sure there's probably better books, but this one seemed compelling because there were 2 prominent individuals. One was like an American Studies person at Princeton, and one is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And the actual book was written by a random Princeton undergrad, but the two other authors both contributed to the ideas. And again, the fact that their understanding of marriage was so framed in Catholic terms and didn't seem to understand non-Catholic understandings of marriage really at all, I basically ended up, I am not convinced, and maybe someone can convince me, but at this point I feel like the only arguments against same-sex marriage probably have to be religious ones. I mean, we'll see if I change my mind on that again, but this book certainly moved me away from where I was when I started reading it. And then next up, I've talked about Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions and Vision of the Anointed before, and I think both of those are great. And that was part of an unofficial trilogy, where the last book in the trilogy was The Quest for Cosmic Justice. And that book, this is basically a collection of longer essays, and so the first three essays I don't remember a lot about. I felt like he was mostly restating stuff in the first two books. But the third one was called The Quiet Repeal of the American Revolution. And so at this point I need to mention, so I have always been a big critic of the idea of judicial originalism, and I generally try not to read books that I'm expecting to agree with, but in this case I have a lawyer acquaintance who kept telling me that my criticisms of originalism sounded a lot like Chemerinsky, and so I noticed he wrote this book, and I read it, and I was like, yeah, Chemerinsky basically articulated all of my criticisms, and then also a lot of criticisms I hadn't even thought of. And so I've been, consistently critical of the idea of judicial originalism, but Thomas Sowell had made himself credible enough for me that I'm like, if anyone can convince me there's merit to originalism, it would be him. And then his case for originalism, and admittedly it was one part of one essay, but what I noticed about it is that he seemed to be basically doing the fallacy of the excluded middle, where he was assuming that the two options were either interpretation of the law is whatever the courts think is in the public good, or the law is based on the intentions of the original drafters. And I think historically, from what I've seen, for most of US history until after the Second World War, courts generally, they had elements of both of those in it, and they had other elements too, like it wasn't ideological in the way that it kind of started to become after the Second World War. And so this really highlighted to me that I think I'll probably always find originalism, among other things, just incoherent, because it's an attempt to solve a problem introduced by the New Deal era courts by a counter-reaction, which is basically more of the same from the other direction, which I don't think fixes things. And then in my Ginger video also I talked about Mere Christianity, which might have been in this direction because I read a bunch of Lewis at once, but I specifically remember reading this book by Lewis, The Four Loves. His description of Christian charity, and this was before I read Sowell and his constrained versus unconstrained vision, but I'm like, this is setting basically an impossible standard. I've been reading other books that sort of address why, and I think I'm going to want to reread Lewis. But this was one of the books that really crystallized, Lewis managed to address a lot of issues I have with believing in Christian orthodoxy, but he also managed to introduce new ones that have sort of increasingly convinced me that Christian orthodoxy is untenable, or at least it's less tenable than Taoism, which is increasingly sort of what I'm basing my worldview on. So I've talked about this book a few times, Alienated America by Tim Carney, and he sort of argues that we should rebuild our lost civic institutions, starting by people going to church. And I'm like, this is all well and good if you believe in a traditional, conservative Christian or Catholic teaching, but what if you have a desire for religion, but you don't really have a church that fits? And for me, Quakerism, I think, fits, but most people are just never really going to be temperamentally a fit for Quakerism, which requires you to self-police, to do your thinking for yourself. And most people want an institution that's going to tell them what to do, and yet a lot of people are still not really compatible with what more traditional religions in the US have to offer. And so what's the solution to that? And so this one is not a backfiring book, but I need to mention it to introduce the next book, which my brother mentioned when I talked about reading Alienated America, and that is Recapture the Rapture by Jamie Wheel. And so my brother had mentioned this book as recommended by a family friend who does not remember recommending it to him. But anyways, he's basically arguing that you can create new religions through experimentation that will be basically what he calls God 3.0. And I was open to it when I read it, but his presentation is so bad, and I shouldn't be surprised because his first book, Stealing Fire, is basically in praise of the Silicon Valley tech bro set. But he has 3 sort of foundational principles that any religion should have. And so there's Bayes, there's Occam's razor, and I forget the third one. But what was obviously missing for me was Chesterton's fence. He also encourages peak experiences through drug use. And reading this whole thing, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is just a way to, and he says he's trying to build ethical cults, and I'm like, yeah, no, you're just going to be building cults. And so I feel like any religious revival needs to come out of existing traditions, living traditions, and new religions can eventually reroot themselves or root themselves, find new roots, but it's going to be a slow and painful process. Like, I feel like Mormonism has done a good job of this, but it's also come at the cost of, you can ask a lot of both ex-Mormons and also non-Mormons in Utah, like, Mormonism, I think, is still finding itself, and that's 200 years old. So it's trying to build a religion from scratch, like, deliberately, especially the way that Jamie Wheel is recommending. I'm like, yeah, no, I really think that you need to follow some existing tradition, some living tradition, and build on that, trying to innovate only the minimum necessary to make it work for contemporary times, which actually set me up to be more sympathetic to Lewis's argument. And I think it's possible I might have been convinced with Lewis, if not for the fact that I had Taoism to point to and say, all of my issues with Christianity, Taoism kind of addresses. And now I get to 3 books that have kind of a very similar theme. And the first of these, so one of my viewers recommended Tyler Cowen. He didn't recommend any specific book, but this one, Stubborn Attachment, sounded interesting. And basically his thesis is, he describes this idea of a Crusonia tree that basically will, like, yield positive sum benefits well into the future, and he's like, we should try to grow Crusonia trees. And the logic is forced, but, like, I had been, when I read this book, very much that was my thinking about things, is we should be trying to figure out how can we sort of create, like, positive sum interactions, like cybernetic effects that will help us out in the long term, that will lead to better prosperity and material happiness. However, I had a few issues with that going into this book that Tyler Cowen just didn't address. And one of the big issues that I had with this idea is change is disruptive. And so there's sort of a paradox of the same cybernetic effects that make people richer and give us more options in the long term tend to make a lot of us poorer and feel more hemmed in the short term. And you can still have, like, given enough time, you can compare and see people voting with their feet to move to the more prosperous societies, but it takes a while to get there. And then the other thing is that he was so focused on ultra long-termism, and I've said many times my position is that we can really look 3 generations ahead, 3 generations back. That's the span of living memory. And beyond that, it's ridiculous to try. And so the fact that the analogy was labored, that he didn't address some of my big concerns, I'd have to reread it because I think there are a couple others he didn't address too, but that sort of this paradox of, in the short term, stuff that is positive sum cybernetic effects makes a lot of us worse off and less free, but then in the long term can do better. And his own obsession with hyper long-termism, which I'm skeptical of to begin with, basically made me think, yeah, I don't think he thought this out at all. I feel like he was talking with tech bros and people like that and not people who live in the real world, or if he wasn't understanding them. And then related to that, I talked about this book. In fact, it was the last book in my video on 11 books that disrupted my worldview, turned my world upside down, The Fatal Conceit by F.A. Hayek. And I mentioned, and I didn't really explain myself well, and I'm probably still not going to completely explain myself because I'm trying to keep this video fairly short, but so he's trying to sort of overturn assumptions about the possibility of egalitarianism, and in that respect, he succeeded. And so I've talked about John Gray, The Two Faces of Liberalism, and how, so Gray defines 4 elements of liberalism, which are universalism, egalitarianism, individualism, and meliorism, or the ability to deliberately effect positive change. And I've said that I also add rationalism to that, and then rationalism, meliorism, universalism I had given up on. But I continued to cling to individualism and egalitarianism. And so F.A. Hayek did a good job of disabusing me of my belief in egalitarianism in the way that I did, so I've realized there are actually three conceptions of egalitarianism that people use at least. And so one is equality of outcomes, one is equality of opportunity, and then the third is equality of rights. And generally the debate that I see is between the first two of these. Equality of rights is the oldest one, and I think it's one that Hayek himself would endorse, but it's pretty much fallen out of our modern political discourse. And this was the book that really convinced me that you can't have equality of opportunity, even in principle. In fact, it's probably less achievable than equality of outcome. But the other thing that he also at the same time undermined my belief in individualism, because he's arguing in an economic context and in terms of certain legal norms in favor of the cybernetic effects of what he calls spontaneous order, what I often call emergent order. And so the thing is, well, two things. So one is he acknowledges that, and I've seen other people claim this, that they're generally critics of libertarianism, and Hayek acknowledges markets depend on governments and bureaucracies. And I'm like, okay, if Hayek is saying it, I don't know if you're familiar with the principle of embarrassment, but if people say things that are detrimental to their cause, it's much more likely to be true than if it's affirmative. And the other thing, the greatest risk to a lot of, especially cybernetic wealth creation mechanisms, is people tend to object to them and tend to try to want to do things to rein them in for various reasons. And I had sort of just thought of it as a strictly economic thing, but when Hayek laid it out in terms of basically legal norms also being the same kind of cybernetic order, I'm like, well, it seems to me like people objecting to these runaway wealth creation feedback loops is also a cybernetic effect. And so it seems, A, it seems pointless to rail against it, and B, it sort of, I think, demonstrates we can't operate as individuals. And I might not be explaining this well, and I'll try to explain it again better in a future video. But so that was oh wow, these last two tenets of liberalism, at least as I've understood them, I can no longer believe in. And for some of them, there may be older, less expansive interpretations I can believe. Like I've mentioned, I think it's still possible to believe in equality of rights, although we'll see. And likewise with meliorism, the way we generally understand it is you can consciously engineer long-term social progress. And I think you can have meliorism on a short-term and a local scale. You just can't plan it for longer. So, and I believe in reason, just not the rationalism of people who call themselves rationalists. So I think a lot of these tenets of liberalism I could still believe in an older sense, but at least the modern sense of egalitarianism and individualism, I was like, wow, I can't really believe in either of these after reading it. And so pretty much immediately after reading Hayek, I read Francis Fukuyama's Liberalism and Its Discontents, because I had read his Political Order series, and I found that to be pretty good work. And so I'm like, he seems like a thoughtful, analytical writer who really thinks about things. So hopefully he can sort of address some of my concerns. And the thing that I noticed about this is that he basically didn't address any of my concerns. He basically did the standard, Burkean conservative, we've gotten too selfish as a culture and we need to pull together more as a community thing, and some government regulation is okay on account of that. And I'm like, okay, but I've always accepted that it's okay in principle. What I've questioned is how it works, especially as social engineering. And aside from that, all of the issues that I've been struggling with philosophical liberalism, Fukuyama basically didn't address any of them. He just addressed very basic complaints that I feel weren't even really relevant to my concerns. And so, again, I don't remember a lot of specifics, just that I was amazed that the guy who wrote the Political Order series, which was so thoughtful and rigorous and took so much into account, could write a book like this that seemed so out of touch. And this is why I've mentioned Like, I think if I had made it into academia and become a professor, like, I probably would be like Fukuyama or Pinker, where he clearly means well, clearly wants to do well, but he is so out of touch with reality that he isn't even really getting to, like, I feel like, big issues that are leading people to discontent with the modern world order based on philosophical liberalism. And then, so, as I mentioned, at this point I was fully questioning philosophical liberalism, and I'd already been kind of trying to understand conservatism, and my conclusion, in short, is basically A, conservatism really isn't one thing, and B, none of the subparts of conservatism that make it up really have a worldview that I find coherent. But there are the people who identify as reactionaries who go beyond conservatism and often reject the liberal world order. And I've been trying to read, like, people who frame themselves as explicitly anti-liberal in general. And one thing that strikes me is, like, if you look at anthropological accounts of other cultures, how even, like, Marxists, left anarchists, reactionaries, they all share most of the assumptions of philosophical liberalism. I mean, as do I. Like, it is very much, even people who frame themselves as anti-liberal are still permeated by it in a way that makes it really hard to think outside that. But, so one of the groups I have tried looking at, tried reading, tried understanding are the reactionaries who frame themselves as being anti-liberal. And I find some of the stuff some of them have to say interesting. However, for the most part, aside from Nick Land, I haven't seen them say a lot that seems particularly worthwhile or useful to me. And I think one of the best examples of that is this book, The Reactionary Mind, by Michael Warren Davis. Reading this book, this guy sounds like a guy who I would really enjoy, like, meeting with, like, talking to, like, having coffee or something and having a conversation. However, he fails to address, basically, my reading of this book is that he's like a trad-cath LARPer, basically. I suspect he probably comes from Protestantism, because a lot of his, like, I know Catholics, I know a fair bit about Catholicism, and a lot of his theological views seem very Protestant to me. But also, like, you'll see a lot of Catholics try to argue, return to Catholicism, it's the traditional religion of the West, and the problem with that is, especially if you're making the argument, we were sort of ruined by Enlightenment, and then Protestantism produced the Enlightenment, so let's go back to Catholicism, is Catholicism both produced Protestantism and contributed heavily to the Enlightenment through the Counter-Reformation. And so the Catholicism of today is not the Catholicism of the medieval era. So even if you were right, like, you can't go back to what Catholicism was. And I felt like, again, he didn't, even aside from the whole trad-cath LARPer thing, and then there were things he did, like he called G.K. Chesterton a reactionary, which Chesterton was an outspoken liberal, like classical liberal, but still he was identified as a liberal. And so he very much accepted the Enlightenment. He was just a Catholic who was critical of people being dumb about stuff. And so I feel like he doesn't have a good sense of what reactionary is, and he treats it more as an aesthetic. But I also feel like he doesn't acknowledge, really, the validity of the concerns behind the Enlightenment in the first place. And I have not read a single reactionary thinker who has convinced me that the Enlightenment was a mistake, but they haven't pushed me in the opposite direction. This one, I think, maybe pushed me in the opposite direction a bit, because the interesting thing is, he is not really even reactionary, like, compared to some of these other people I'm reading. He shares a lot of liberal assumptions, even in comparison to someone like Nick Land or like Bonald, who I mentioned in my 4th of July video. And so, yeah, I feel like I would like meeting this guy. But as a book, it pushed me, if anything, in the opposite direction. Because I said, all the other reactionaries I've read, they haven't at least pushed me into being, yeah, the Enlightenment was definitely right. This one, just by the fact that he doesn't even really, I feel like he doesn't really understand the reasons for or the consequences of the Enlightenment, pushed me in that direction a little bit. And he also sort of underlined it. I'd read some of these other trad-caths too, but it was reading Michael Warren Davis where I was really like, oh, this whole trad-cath, like, counter-enlightenment thing is fundamentally incoherent. So anyways, yeah, so these are, again, 9 books that sort of backfired on me, pushed me in the opposite direction. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. If you want to support me, I have affiliate links and Ko-Fi below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.